Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Korea Society's Young Professionals Night webcast. My name is Yoon Park, Development Officer of the Korea Society. 2021 is a very special year because it marks our YPN's 10-year anniversary. YPN has provided numerous programs in public policy, education, business, and arts, while created networking places for the young professionals, especially in New York City. It'd be great to see everyone in person, but under the circumstances, we were unable to hold in-person events. But we do hope that you're all safe and healthy. As COVID-19 has changed many parts of our life, including education, we have invited Susan Kim, CEO of Edmodo, for today's program. Edmodo is a global education technology platform with over 100 million users worldwide. Susan graduated from Harvard College and received her MBA from the Harvard Business School. Before joining Edmodo, she was a CEO of EatWith, Plum District, and held multiple leadership positions at Google and eBay. Suzanne currently serves on the board of directors for the Council of Korean American, which is our partner organization for today's event. A moderator for today's event is Sang Lee, president and CEO of DarcMatter and Konstellation. It's the second time that Sang is joining us as our moderator. We show great thanks to Sang. Thank you. And Sang also serves as a president of KSE, Korean Startups and Entrepreneurs, which is another partner organization for today's event. So welcome everyone, and hope you all enjoy the program tonight, as Susan will share her astonishing career and experiences in the consumer technology and online education. So now please join me in welcoming Susan and Sang.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Yoon, for that kind introduction. Really happy to be here as a second-time moderator. Really glad to be here with Susan Kim. One thing I do want to mention is that the recorded video will be uploaded to Korea Society's YouTube channel and official website. As you mentioned, my name is Sang Lee. I'm the founder of DarcMatter and Konstellation, fintech platforms headquartered in New York City. I also serve as the president for a nonprofit organization called Current Startups and Entrepreneurs, and we're really glad to be co-hosting this event with Korea Society. I am joined here by Susan Kim, who you definitely set a great groundwork on the introduction. But Susan, could you give the audience a little bit background information on yourself, and why don't we take it from there?
Sure. So I think you covered kind of the big things, but earlier before this webcast started, we were just having this conversation, and I mentioned that I'd grown up in Western Pennsylvania, Eastern Ohio. I was actually born in Korea, so I was born in Daegu. And my parents immigrated to the States when I was just a year old. And they came, so they immigrated in 1975. There was a big wave of immigration at that time. And my dad was a doctor. And, the only place he could really get a job was like in the middle of nowhere. And so that's how I settled, kind of grew up in this like tiny town. And it was a very, I was just kind of joking around about my parents raised me as if time had stopped, like 1970s Daegu, so it was a pretty strict kind of Korean upbringing. We were super sheltered, but it was juxtaposed against being foreigners in this land where, I think there was like 2 other Korean families that lived in the town. And so from the time I was young, my parents kind of instilled in me that, as an immigrant, and as an Asian at the time, nobody really knew, like particularly in that area, where Korea even was, And so my parents had instilled in me, you have to, work twice as hard. You have to achieve 4 times as much to kind of be on par with everybody else. And was also kind of like very strictly kind of given this mandate of, you need to like be a doctor, because as an immigrant, it's a skill, and it'll be just a much better life if you do that. So I kind of grew up with that mentality. As you can tell, I didn't end up being a doctor, and it was actually through just kind of a lot of what seemed like bad luck, but in retrospect was quite good luck, which was when I got to college, again, my parents had kind of prescribed, okay, you're going to be a doctor and you're going to go to Harvard. When I got into Harvard, I thought my job as a dutiful Korean kid was done. I was like, sweet. And so I had loaded up all my pre-med classes my freshman year and then proceeded to not go to class. And so there was no way that I would have gone into med school. And so from there was just kind of figuring out for the first time, independent of what my parents want me to do,
Right.
what do I want to do?
Right.
And so I knew nothing about business.
Right.
And so my senior year in college, I started going to all of these recruiting events and just was just amazed by the fact that, hey, right out of college, you could get these jobs advising companies, whether it's through consulting or investment banking. And I thought, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And so as I was thinking about what I wanted to do, it really came down to banking and consulting. I thought I want to learn about what this is, about what business is, life outside of a career in medicine. But I ended up going to a firm called Booz Allen Hamilton. The strategy piece of that business no longer exists. I think it got absorbed into PricewaterhouseCoopers. But at the time, Booz Allen Hamilton was one of the large consulting firms, but they let kids right out of college specialize into a group. And so I went in and I picked Booz Allen because I got to specialize in entertainment and media, because while I did not know anything about business, as a consumer of entertainment and media, I was genuinely really interested in that.
Right.
And so that's how I ended up in consulting. And then from there, this was the rise. I had been in consulting for about 3 years. And in the early to mid 90s was the rise of the first dot boom.
Right.
And a lot of people were heading out west. And so I also proceeded out west. You had 20 somethings raising a ton of money.
Right.
And then proceeded to also lose a ton of money. So that's how I, sort of my first experience with startups and the internet. And again, it was all by happenstance.
Right.
And and then I decided, during that recession of like early 2000s to go to business school and then try to refigure out what I wanted to do.
Awesome. If we could, take a little bit of a step back.
Yeah.
You were talking about, how you were growing up in like a smaller town, the first wave of immigration from Korea. And I think we kind of talked about, I guess, the initial positives, let's call it, on the social pressures, if you will, like with your parents. As a Korean American kind of first, second, we'll call it 1.5 Korean generation. Did you face any other kind of external social pressures growing up in that small town or going to school, like in your professional career?
So are you talking about sort of the competing pressures of what it was like to grow up
as a Korean American professional or student? Yeah, at the time.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I feel like initially when I was young, it was about how to, in some ways, disappear, but at the same time, strive to be seen. Because I stuck out like a sore thumb, I wanted to be as quiet as possible. I didn't want to bring attention to myself because it was always the question, are you Chinese? No. Are you Japanese? No. Then what are you? And just, I even had trouble saying the word, I'm Korean, So there was this notion of trying to disappear and not bring attention to myself. But at the same time, though, and I think that's something that Korean Americans, Asian Americans struggle with today is this model minority and wanting to be seen, right? And having a seat at that table. And I would say like in the earlier part of my career, and especially growing up, again, as I mentioned, like I grew up under the norms of like frozen in time 1970s Gyeongsando, right? And this notion of being a good girl, so when I got my first job in consulting, it was so foreign to me that you could call the partners by their first name. I just thought that was like so weird, right? And it was to be a good girl and to be quiet, take good notes, and a lot of times there'd be a meeting and there'd be a big conference table and I wouldn't even take a seat at the table. I would sit in a chair to the side, because, people more important than me should be sitting there, right? And so I think again, like as you mentioned, there are really good things about the way that we grew up, right? Which is put your head down, work hard, right? And so, I did that, But business and startups and technology, at some point, and I think this is what a lot of Asian Americans struggle with, because when you look at, for example, the percentage of Asian Americans that enter like top tier schools, right?
Yeah.
It's really high.
Yeah.
And then you look at the percentage of Asian Americans who get, that first job out of college. It's
Yeah.
pretty high.
Yeah.
But what is the percentage of Asian Americans that are Fortune 500 CEOs, right? Or sit on, board seats? I mean, there are more white guys named John than there are Asian Americans, right? That are top Fortune 500 CEOs. So I think it's that struggle of, initially it was like, okay, I don't want to be seen. And then it was, I do want to be seen. But a lot of that training of just put your head down, take a seat on the side, doesn't really work, And that's something that I would say I really struggled with early on, where I was like, I work really hard and I do really good work, but yet, feedback was, in terms of like that next promotion, oh, well, we need to see more leadership skills, right? Like, what the fuck does that mean? Doesn't leadership just mean being the best, And so I think those are the things that, I think all of us sort of need to start to really take a look at. And leadership skills doesn't mean all of a sudden being different from who you are. I'm not telling any of us to pretend to be someone else.
Right.
Leadership, though, there's, again, kind of what you said, which I like what you said, which is there are so many amazing things about growing up Korean American and being Korean, right? Assets that come with that. But at the same time, it's like we need to start thinking about what our authentic leadership style is, being true to ourselves and being heard, right? And making ourselves be heard to enact change, but to do that in a way that's authentic to who we are. And I think that's, as I was thinking about, like you had mentioned, again, congratulations, the 10-year anniversary of YPN, but just sort of advice that I would impart. And I think part of that is to find your authentic voice. In order to do that, go to places where you are genuinely interested in the topic matter or the industry that you're generally interested in learning. And I think that's when you can bring your whole self, into your work environment. I think that helps one discover your true self, because that sort of filtered, unbridled excitement for something. I think excitement is contagious, and being a leader is about getting other people excited about something. And you can only do that if it's genuine.
Right. And I guess that was kind of your driver as well, right? Like after Booz Allen, when you went over kind of to the tech side of things, it was something that sparked your kind of personal interest, and you probably had your own, kind of career ideas and challenges, right? Like being in that environment. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So I'm gonna be totally honest. So when I left Booz Allen to join my first startup, it was not out of a genuine, oh, I'm really fascinated by this. It was literally like, oh my gosh, so many people are going to California and their companies are IPOing and they're becoming really rich.
Yeah. I'm missing out. FOMO.
Yeah, I had FOMO. And I would say though, it was a blessing. I joined this startup called iHome. There was a friend of mine that from undergrad who had moved back to California, to San Diego, and with his high school friend who had just sold 2 businesses to NBC or iVillage before their IPO. And he was starting a third venture, and they needed someone to run marketing and business development. And so, they asked if I wanted to move out to San Diego, and I was like, sure. Without really much thought to it. But I joined the company November of 1999. The market crashed April of 2000. And so, it was a lesson of what is the fundamental business that we're building, right? Before it was like, I literally from November to April, just because we were blah, blah, blah.com. I mean, it was like a party, it was very ridiculous. And so I think that wake up call. So I went to business school to kind of think about, okay, well, what do I want to do? And for me, it was about, I really love businesses that impact consumers, that direct to, like the B2C businesses. And so I thought originally when I went to business school that I wanted to be a brand manager. And I thought, okay, I want to go work in consumer goods. But I entered business school in 2001. And 9/11 happened within the first couple of weeks of school.
Right.
And it wasn't the greatest job market. And I had also just gotten married right before business school. And my husband was in San Francisco. And so we were doing long distance. So I actually, out of business school, really wanted to move back to New York. And so I, got one job offer to go be a brand manager at L'Oreal in New York. And my husband, though, grew up on the West Coast and did not want to move to New York. And also, it would be very difficult for him to, frankly, find a job in New York. And so I turned down my one and only job offer and graduated with no job offer. And I started, at that point, I started looking for a job in June.
Okay.
And I applied. I was like thinking, okay, it has to be something that I'm really interested in. So again, it was like the consumer packaged goods companies or the retailers, Gap, Williams Sonoma, et cetera. And then I had, through a friend, started buying things on this website called eBay. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's so cool. You get these like amazing things. And so I plot my resume there. And lo and behold, I got a call back. And what was really interesting is that the hiring manager of the job, I used to work with at Booz Allen. We were in the same practice group. And he was a few years older than me. And he saw my name on a pile of resumes and pulled it out. Really fascinating, right? And so, that's how I ended up at eBay. And eBay is, to this day, one of the best work experiences I've ever had. I learned so much. It was so valuable. I'd say more valuable than business school from a content perspective. And the things that I got to work on, the people I got to work with and to get to know, I've made friends for life at eBay. Every subsequent job I've gotten after eBay had to do with like an eBay connection, so it's just, again, when I look back at eBay on Sunday nights, I would be so excited because I would think, oh, I get to go to work tomorrow. Whoever experiences that, right?
Who says that?
But it was just, I felt like we worked really hard, but we also laughed so hard. And we all, at the time at eBay, was about, hey, we're using technology to create opportunity for millions of people. So our whole thing was, regardless of whether you're a small guy or a big guy, it doesn't matter. We're democratizing access to commerce. And so the little mom and pops could compete against the Walmarts of the world. And that was the mission, and it was a value that we all espoused. And I think to this day, what I get really excited about is using technology to level the playing field, to create opportunity, right? And I think that, which brings me to a company like Edmodo, where when you think about education, right? And bringing technology into classrooms, our kids are growing up completely technologically literate. Like my 10-year-old can do things on a computer that I'm like, how did you do that? And so to be able to use technology, not only, into like, for kids like, like mine, but to bring technology to improve outcomes in areas that are underserved. And I think that whether it's in here, the States, around the world, I think there's a huge opportunity where technology can level that playing field. And it's those types of opportunities and why I think technology is so cool. So that's, what I get excited about.
Can we take a little bit of step back? Let's talk about the transition into Edmodo, right? Like after your jobs, like what happened in between? to get to Edmodo, and then let's talk about a little bit about the journey of Edmodo itself as well.
Yeah. So I guess in between, after eBay, I left and joined Google. Google at the time was very big. I mean, it's not as big as it is now, but I mean, there were 20,000 employees.
Yeah.
And at eBay, it was much smaller, where I literally knew everybody. But I went to Google. I think of Google as management boot camp because I joined the operations team. And so right off the bat, I was managing a large team. And so when I left Google, my team was like about 250 people across 3 continents. And so it was really about how do I scale leadership? Because at eBay, I had like a small team, but it was really about like my ability to influence one-on-one, and I think I always knew that I wanted to be a CEO. I was too afraid to say it for a long time. But because like when you look at my career, I've done product marketing, I've done some marketing, I've done some product management, resource allocation, ops, I've managed the customer support teams. Like I have gone and know a little bit, enough, but I haven't really gone deep into a function. And, I think that so for me, again, Google was really about, okay, I know that I'm not going to be the one doing all the work. I want to be able to influence, and I want to be able to really manage effectively across a large team. And so that's why I went to Google, and it was incredible. And I would say the other thing that really, I loved my team at eBay. Around the mid to late 2000s is when a lot of the early eBayers started to leave. Right. To me, I at the time was going to stay just because I love the company so much. But I remember when Google called, they said, just come and meet some people. Yeah. And for me, when I went very skeptical, right? Because I was like, I wasn't really thinking about leaving eBay. I was blown away by the caliber of talent at Google. Just blown away. I mean, there are some really freaking smart people at Google, and I was just so amazed. So I actually left to, again, to manage these amazing people, but also to surround myself with this caliber of talent. And I think, another piece of advice, or sort of takeaway that is wherever you go, pick who you're going to work with or who you surround yourself with wisely, right? And so I thought, God, if I could even just absorb even a little bit of this, that'd be amazing. Right. And then from Google, I at that time thought, okay, well, this is such a big company. And I was like such a tiny cog in the wheel that I thought, okay, I want to go to a startup now. And so I went to a startup called Minted. The function wasn't for me. And so I ended up, it was interesting. And this is kind of where the eBay network comes in. I had met a VC who's based in New York, who's actually one of my favorite VCs. His name is Ben Sun, and he's with Primary Ventures.
Primary?
Yep. And I met him through a really good friend of mine from eBay. Okay. And he had contacted me, actually, this was many, many years ago. What year would this have been? Long time ago. Yeah. Asking me if I'd be interested in working for this company that he was a super early investor in, based in Korea, called Coupang. And to this day, he still makes fun of me. He's like, you should have gone there. But we had just a really good conversation. And this was some time ago. I left, as I mentioned, I went to a startup after I left Google, and had left the company, and I took about 4 months off, and I was just really trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I was having a lot of conversations with people. And so Ben called me on a Friday. I remember this very distinctly. And he goes, hey, do you want to be the CEO of Plum District? Plum District was a daily deal site for moms. And back when daily deals were very, very sexy. And but the company had raised a lot of money, and they were not doing well because the whole bottom of that whole daily deals market cratered. And there was just a bunch of other issues. But so Ben called me, asked me, hey, Plum District is backed by Kleiner and Comcast Ventures and General Catalyst, and they really think there's something that can be salvaged here. Would you be interested in coming and being the CEO? That phone call was on a Friday. On Monday, I met with Aileen Lee, who at the time was managing she was the investor representing Kleiner Perkins. She's now has her own firm.
Right.
On Wednesday, I met again with Aileen and Amy Bands at Comcast Ventures. On Thursday, I met with Neil Sakara at General Catalyst. They gave me the offer on Friday, and I started on Monday.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I mean, it was really fast.
Yeah.
They had been looking for a bit. They wanted someone with the marketplace's background.
Yeah.
They wanted someone with kind of that product marketing kind of viewpoint, and they also wanted a mom, someone who really understood the consumer, the user.
Right. Right.
And Plum District was a mess, and I inherited it. And within 4 quarters of a year, we got the company to profitability and sold it. And I had, while it was so stressful, I don't think I've ever been happier. Like it was just, it was just such a, like an adrenaline rush, you know?
Okay.
And to be in the seat where not only, actually to be in a position where I could really establish the culture of a company and to create a team and a well-functioning team and to, you know, give opportunity to people. I think for me, that's something that is my like kind of biggest joy. And so, yeah, I mean, that was Plum District. And then from there, I went to a company, another startup called EatWith, which is, think of it as like Airbnb for home chefs. So it enables any chef to kind of essentially operate a communal table or restaurant out of their home. And the investor in there was Greylock. And Simon Rothman, who was the partner at Greylock, I also used to work with at eBay.
Oh, okay.
So you'll kind of see
the eBay mafia.
Totally.
Yeah.
And even people who I didn't directly work with at eBay, you know, I find they'll be acting as my reference because they'll remember me, you know, and because again, as I mentioned, eBay was one of my favorite work experiences. I learned so much there. And, you know, just I think when you're genuinely loving what you do and, you know, you are bringing your best self and you're making other people around you better. People may not remember what exactly you worked on, but they remember how you made them feel. Right.
Okay.
And so I think it's that memory of like, sort of what it's like to work with someone that has been, again, just, and the eBay network and the eBay alums have gone on to do such amazing things that it's just been really a pleasure to kind of run into them again through, you know, various businesses. So that's how I ended up at EatWith. And then that business we also sold. And then I took some time off and got approached for Edmodo. And, you know, Edmodo, the situation with Edmodo, so Edmodo was one of the first EdTech platforms, actually. It was founded in, I believe they launched in 2010. Was it 2009, 2010? And at the time, you know, they had attracted some pretty big investors. So Reid Hoffman was the board chair. You had Matt Kohler from Benchmark, because they were bringing technology into classrooms. And they were really focused on teachers. So the sort of mission statement at the time was, Edmodo is an EdTech platform built by teachers for teachers. And so the growth of Edmodo the first several years out was just explosive. I mean, and with very minimal marketing. So they were, it was like a lot of viral word of mouth, and went adopted by teacher by teacher, classroom by classroom. And I think the challenge in EdTech is monetization, because who you're building the product for is different from who decides whether to buy your product. All right. So you've got administrators, et cetera, IT directors who are actually making the decision. And so really understanding both sets of user needs is pretty critical. And so coming in now for me, so I joined Edmodo in September of 2019. Is, you know, again, like we've got we have the benefit of the fact that, we have a really large user base and it's global.
Right.
And it's actually our outside of the US business that's growing much, much faster.
Right.
Because I think in the US, there's a lot of, well, there's no shortage of funding. There's a lot of various startups. You also have, actually they're global, but you also have Google Classroom, which is a free product, which will remain free, which puts a lot of challenges from I think a monetization standpoint. And so it's really this, there's a lot of good things at the company. And so how do you then build on those strengths? And I think in this past year in 2020, COVID presented this like kind of crazy, in some ways, opportunity, because we always talked about the future of education. And all of a sudden, the future of education is now, because you had schools, an entire country scrambling to get online. And so I think the interesting thing will be post-COVID, right? Because these online tools, I mean, Edmodo was in a lot of use prior to COVID. It's something that teachers had talked about. They felt like Edmodo gave them superpowers in and out of the classroom. They were able to reach different types of students, to engage them in a different way. Is post-COVID, what does that landscape look like? And I think what's interesting is what, at least in the US, what you're seeing is consolidation behind two of the big players in the space. And they are very popular with the admins and the IT directors. They come with a whole suite of like integration with information systems and et cetera. And what Edmodo, the strength of Edmodo has always been around this notion of creating community in the classroom. So the interface was modeled after Facebook. It's a very familiar interface. And I think what we're finding in COVID is the fact that you can get your kids online, right? So you can use a mix of like Zoom, Google Classroom, right? Or one of the big providers, it's Canvas and PowerSchool Schoology. But how do you actually, I think one of the things about like learning in general is that you don't learn just from modules or from the teacher, but it's also from your fellow students and through discussion. And so I think that part of it is vitally important. And that's where we see an opportunity. And so I think that, when I think about what's going to happen post-COVID, is to really make sure that we nail the value proposition of community and collaboration. We had a lot of stories of teachers who found like a virtual teaching partner, like halfway around the world, they're able to share curriculum and things like that. And so making sure that we are like positioning ourselves in a way of, I think about post-COVID, for example, social and emotional well-being, mental health, and really making sure that schools are equipped with training their teachers to be able to, who knows? I look at my own kids who have been like, in their rooms for like the past year doing online school or some form of hybrid, but what will be the long-term impact of over a year of essentially pretty much like social isolation, because I think about things like that. And I think the other big thing coming out of COVID is a recognition that the learning experience or the learning outcomes between, call it, for lack of a better term, the haves and the have-nots, that gap is getting wider and wider. Where like the private schools and whatnot have been able to figure out a way to go hybrid, et cetera. But then in some of these really underserved districts, those kids haven't been in school. So I think particularly with the most recent round of funding from the government, a lot of those funds are earmarked to address that gap. And so I think that there's an opportunity there.
Okay. And I think that leads me into kind of my next question, which was, you you've made some like really big strides, I think, after, you left eBay, and you said you didn't know if you wanted to become a CEO until you actually had done it. And I think for, a lot of Korean American professionals or Asian American professionals in general, that may be something that never, strikes me in my mind, right? Like, I can be a CEO, I can be in leadership. And you've also kind of seen it through, like, you've taken over a company that's probably going through one of the worst crises that, we've seen in the last century or so. And, you've had to step up, you've had to, lead the team. Do you think I guess the school or like your professional background, like what about it was most critical? And the reason I asked this is I think a lot of people hear your amazing story and they're like, my story is not that amazing, so I can't do that, right? And I think that's a very like Korean American response, like in the mind, like I didn't do exactly that, so I can't get there. So what do you think, like during your journey, was the most important that made you a successful CEO, that helped these companies out and brought you to where you are today with Edmodo?
In some ways, again, because like I recognize that I look good on paper. I actually think that I got to where I am, and this is going to sound a little weird, despite what I look like on paper. Okay. And the reason why I say that is that particularly like in business and in tech or in an entrepreneurial space, what is the single most important characteristic, right, of success? Honestly, it's scrappiness, persistence, right, tenacity, not giving up, not being confined by like what people tell you is possible. I think that's the most important thing. And I think for me, if I think about it, and again, this is going to sound maybe a little disingenuous, so I apologize, but I have, again, part of it is because where I grew up and how I grew up, I've always sort of felt like an outsider and an underdog, and I think that has I've maintained that feeling throughout my whole life. I still like feel like, that awkward bad perm braces girl, who sat in the back of the bus. Like,
it's awfully specific.
Like that's who I still feel like I am. And it's, it's that, like, when I was at Google and we hired a lot of people right out of college, and so I interviewed a lot of people. And the ones that were the superstars were the ones that did not come from like the Ivy League schools. They came from these like state schools from the middle of nowhere, because it's this mentality of, hey, I'm grateful for this opportunity and I'm going to make the best of it. And I'm going to roll my sleeves up and I'm going to do the work. It's like that sort of mentality. And I guess for me, it was not only was it because I grew up in a small town, but I think for me, a really defining moment in my life was as someone who grew up always wanting to do everything, like please my parents and to do everything that they wanted me to do. When I told them that I was not going to be a doctor, and I told them, I had this conversation, I called them, it was during my sophomore year in college, I was weeping, like I was just so like devastated. Right. And to this day, I still feel like I'm making up for that.
It's a long time.
I know. But I think it's always sort of given me this notion that I have to prove myself, and I have to, work hard, and I have to be scrappy. And so it's, this, and again, I think that's also why I like businesses where you're using technology to level the playing field, to create opportunity for the underdog, because again, it sounds disingenuous because I know how I look on paper, but I always relate to the underdog.
And I mean, you're talking about the scrappiness, right? So like you've kind of jumped industries as well with the companies, with your career, and that's not particularly like traditional professional services, right? That's not something that really happens. Maybe like 15, 20 years at consulting, then you take over a big company or something like that. What do you think about, like, how did you survive in each of these roles, and like like you weren't the sector expert at the time, right?
Yeah,
So
no, absolutely.
how did you take over these companies?
Again, I think in terms of the opportunities present itself through the network that you build, and the
Okay.
reputation that you build of, what is it that this company needs? It needs leadership. It needs to, it needs, fiscal discipline. How do you get people excited about this product? How do you get employees excited about this product? And so I would say there are sort of core fundamentals that are very similar across all of these opportunities. But also, for me personally, I think jumping into like a new industry, that learning curve, I find very invigorating. Like it really kind of gets to this notion of being a lifelong learner. And there's something about coming in sort of blind where you're like, okay, I've got to learn and I've got to learn really fast.
Right.
I actually, for me, that gets me super excited,
Right.
And so I think, and it's funny because I sometimes think that your first job or one of your early jobs does do a little bit of career imprinting on a person. So again,
Okay.
I mentioned I started out in consulting. And while I
Right.
specialized in entertainment and media, the clients were very different. Publishing houses, TV, movie studios, newspaper business that was worried about, is the internet going to kill our classifieds business? Like things like that.
Yeah.
But just having
Yes.
to like get up to, the answer would be yes.
Yes.
And it was having to get up to speed really quickly. Like you learn to kind of drop in and to get up to speed and to absorb information and to make connections, across like different spheres. And I think there's something about that I really like. I tend to be like the sprinter, then take a break, sprinter, then take a break. And so there is something about being in environments like that where I do feel like I'm thrown into the deep end that I actually really like.
Well, it's really interesting. So, I kind of tell like to younger friends, etc. I kind of give the advice of like, if you ever want to do something really hard, become a consultant or a banker for a year. And if you do well there, you'll probably do really well anywhere else. Because no one's going to give you any answers and you're going to sink or swim. And that's just going to be it. And do you think like, if somebody wants to be either in the startup field, in tech, do you think it's not, I don't want to say necessary, right? But in your experience, do you think it's additive, right? Do you think it's accretive to have professional services somewhere first and then kind of learn the ropes and then jump into the tech thing? Does it matter? Like, can they go straight into tech, into startup? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, I'm going to say that I think I'm a little bit biased, but I do think that going into professional services first does prepare you well in the sense of being able to articulate a story really well. Whether it's the pitch decks or the decks that you have to write, it's about what is the storyline, what are we trying to say here, and then the supporting data and the evidence, like that serves one well anywhere, right? Because in business today, like my kids always ask me, what do you do? Mommy tries to convince people to do what I tell them to do. How do you do that? Right? And it's, and a lot of that is whether you're talking to investors or whether you're talking to employees. How do you present, like, here's our mission, here's our plan, here's how we're going to get there. Being able to articulate that story really well in a way that's convincing and compelling, that's a really good skill to have. Whether you're the CEO, whether you're a product manager, no matter what, because everyone's jobs are interconnected and you're always having to convince someone to do something.
Absolutely.
Right? So I do think that there is something really nice about professional services. I had mentioned earlier that eBay was one of the best training grounds for me because I took, again, sort of the start of what I learned in consulting, but I had to apply it daily at eBay, particularly when I was chief of staff. I mean, it was about, I got to see, essentially like what the CEO is going to report out to the street. And you realize how much of the work that everyone at the company does, how it gets bubbled up and how it's presented out. And it was interesting because, there's a lot of things that people work on that kind of don't really matter. For me, that was a lesson in like, all these people are fighting over this thing and it doesn't really matter. And, like I remember thinking, I want to make sure that no matter where I am, I'm working on something that actually bubbles up and is going to impact the business. And it generally, I think no matter the size of the business, you can count those initiatives on one hand.
Right.
Probably with like just three fingers, right? And so it's just, you learn about like what is important to a company, what's going to move the business, how do you tell a story, how do you up level, how do you modify, how you convince people depending on the who they are, what types of information does one need to tell? Do I need to like put a lot of data in, or should I up level? I think you start to learn those skills. I definitely learned that, hone those at eBay.
Right.
And I think that's been like super helpful, and
right.
So I would encourage people, like if you can, great, but more important than that is I think just people should go again, anywhere where they are genuinely interested in the subject matter.
Right.
And also go to where the best people are, because you're going to learn from those people. They will set your bar,
Right.
They become in some ways your floor. And if you set the bar really high, your floor is really high, so whether it's like operating with integrity or, the way people interact and just learning from, it's not only just like the content that you're learning, but the way to be a leader, and to go where the best people are.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite physicists, Richard Feynman, he said, if you walk into a room and you're the smartest guy in the room, you're in the wrong room.
Totally. Oh my gosh. Totally.
Yeah.
Yes. One should make it a mantra, like to be the dumbest person in the room, And I think like, part of that is also to be very self-aware,
yes.
And so particularly I think the luxury that I have, being a CEO is I can like craft my team, and I think about, my team right now is way smarter than me, and I'm so excited. Like I like feeling like, ooh, like, cause then it makes you raise your game, but also that self-awareness of like, these are the things that are my blind spots that, I'm not good at, and making sure that the people you surround yourself with, that you're, that is quite complementary. Like I think of my exec team as they are my business partners. They are my thought partners. So I mean, I think.
Awesome.
For sure.
And, I think we're running close on time. So I think, we'll kind of jump into the advice part now. I think that's the part that people have been waiting for. We kind of dealt with it, but I also want to talk about a very specific to COVID. It's something that you probably deal with your team as well on like a daily basis, about the uncertainties in the market. What does post-COVID look like? And I think for a lot of our audience and YPN, either looking for a job or in their job, or they've been remote most of their job, they're thinking about, what's the next shift for them. So, that's a lot. So if you could like kind of hone in on like what you think might be important for a young professional today to focus on, that'd be awesome.
I think I'll touch upon it in a few ways.
Okay.
Particularly, I think earlier in your career, the fact that, and I think about this a lot because I was on a discussion with a bunch of people talking about the future of work, and is work going to stay remote, right? So you have like very well publicized, like Pinterest got out of their big lease, right? Salesforce, Google, Facebook, they're basically saying, employees can work from home, or it'll be flexible work going forward, right? And everyone does not have to be in the office. And I actually applaud that, but at the same time, there is something you miss out by not being in an office, and especially like I think earlier in your career, if you're just kind of dialing into Zoom meetings and then, leave meeting and then so much learning happens in the hallways and those spontaneous conversations and things like that, that I would actually urge people, if given the option, go into the office, or find a place where as much as I'd like to think that COVID proved that you could have remote work and flexible work, but to be honest, I'm going to caveat that the reason, like my team has been super productive, right? But to be honest, what else are we going to do? We're all stuck at home. Right? So I do think that where one can, to go back into an office, and again, with really amazing people that you want to learn from, I do think that is something that I would actually urge people to do. And then I think in terms of now is like a really good time to think about, again, sort of rather than think about maybe like what you want to do. Because to be honest, I didn't figure out what I really wanted to do until much later. But to think about what skills do you want to develop? And as much as, I think there have been a lot of businesses and a lot of sectors that have struggled. There have been a lot of businesses and sectors that have done really well. And those types of businesses become essentially the hot network, meaning like the people who are there are your best talent. And then, in a cycle of like, say 5 years out, those people are going to go to other companies, and then you'll get the call. If you get to work with them, then you'll get the calls later in your career. Like I think eBay was hot late 90s, early 2000s, right? Then it was like Google, then Facebook, like, so one of those companies, I think that would be, again, like clearly, it's probably like 2000 too late, but like, I think Zoom, I think Eric, the CEO of Zoom he is an authentic, genuine leader, he's true to his own style. He's like somewhat soft spoken, but like, I think, thinking about those, industries or companies that are doing well and thinking about, going there to learn from kind of the best of the best, right?
Right.
And then I was just thinking about in general, like I think sectors that are going to explode out of COVID.
Yeah.
Honestly, I think travel and hospitality.
Wow.
I think we all want to get out of the house.
Is that just your personal?
That's just my personal. And then I think the other area, and again, this is again 2000 and late, but maybe not too late, is what we were talking about before the webcast, right? Which is blockchain, cryptocurrency. Again, if find something that you're genuinely interested in. It could be something like you just want to learn about, like you actually think there's something to, decentralized, control of money. There's just something really interesting there. For me, it's like less cryptocurrency that's interesting. I think the blockchain is really interesting.
Yeah.
And like what it can do and the applications, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I would encourage people to think about like what skills you want to, really develop. Is there an area of interest that you want to learn about and to go, explore kind of companies. And actually the other piece of advice I'd give to people is rather than kind of looking for a job per se, meet people doing the job that you think you'd want to do. And just talk to them. Like, I'm not approaching them with like, hey, I want something, but just, hey, I really find what you're doing really interesting. I'd love to learn more. Because at the end of the day, people like talking about themselves, right? So, go and say, hey, I'd love to learn about what you do. Because then that'll give, people a good sense of like, hey, would this be really interesting,
Right.
And you'd make some friends along the way.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really important for me personally. When you get out of school, it's like, oh, networking and like, find the professionals. And then you do that for a while. You're like, wait, this wasn't networking. I just want to make more friends.
Yeah.
And then if I pick up something cool along the way, so be it. It happens kind of naturally.
Yeah.
If that's what it is you're looking for. So I think that, that's a really great piece of advice that I've kind of taken personally over the last couple of years. And since we only have a couple of minutes, if we can talk a little bit more personally, it's probably changed as you've, made a family, but are there any things that you do on a day-to-day basis that that makes you a better leader, that you think, is a big part of your regime? If that's something that you could share with the audience, I think that'd be awesome as well.
Yes. So I'd say a couple things. I think that becoming a parent made me a much better leader because I learned that by being a parent that you cannot control everything.
It's completely out of control. There's nothing you can do about it.
That you have to kind of learn to let go.
Let go.
And that it's about, you have to let people fail, right? And you have to, rather than going with like, here's the answer, it's about, okay, well, you can call it like leading questions. Oh, why do you think that? What do you think would be the, and I think that is, for someone who is like somewhat like type A and a little bit of command and control, I mean, I think that is definitely something that has like helped a lot. And the second thing is something that it's funny. So again, growing up, with very strict kind of Korean parents, there is just really quickly, my father passed away about 3 years ago, and I had always thought about going into therapy, but I was like, I don't need therapy, But after he passed away, just because I felt like I wasn't really processing the grief, I thought, I'm gonna go into therapy. Best decision of my life, because we talk about everything. One of the things that, again, that I kind of bring to sort of my workplace is this notion of validating others, right? That even if you disagree with them, there's always feelings are always valid, and there's always a kernel of truth to those feelings, and that when you validate others, so you can validate, but then also, push for change. And so when I think about how I manage my teams, rather than, saying, again, kind of the way, most of us are raised, which is you're just wrong, anything you're feeling is like wrong. It's the notion of when you validate that you cannot really get behavior change through punitive measures. That behavior change and improvement happens like when you validate and through positive reinforcement. And I think those are the things that I think I've just learned a lot. And again, I apply it to my parenting too. But I think, again, that's something that's like very different. I don't know about you guys, or, the people listening, but, my parents were not validators. They loved me, and they did their best, but they weren't validators. And so a lot of times when I'm going through scenarios, whether it's at work or at home with my therapist, she'll go, so what could you validate there? And I'm like, I don't know. They were just wrong. So there is like a skill to learning to think of, okay, there's feelings are valid, and I need to start validating that and then move on from there. So I'd say those two things have been very helpful.
Awesome. Well, I think we are out of time. Susan, it was a pleasure talking with you. I think after this talk, there's a lot that I would like to talk with you offline about as well.
Me too.
Which is gonna be awesome.
A lot of questions to ask you.
Which is going to be awesome. For the audience, one more time, the recorded video is going to be uploaded on Korea Society's YouTube channel and official website. This was our YPN session with Susan Kim, CEO of Edmodo. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Susan, so much.
Thanks, Sang. Nice to talk to you.
Yep.